Hello Math 2 students. Today we're going to learn about the quadratic formula. If you go through the 4 other ways to solve quadratic equations and none of them look like they're practical, the quadratic formula will always come through in the end. It seems like a little work when you first see it, but then when you realize that it works on every problem, usually students like the quadratic formula. On this problem, we're given the quadratic equation x squared minus 6x equals -5. And we're going to solve this equation. We're going to solve it by using the quadratic formula. In the quadratic formula, you have to know what a, b, and c are from standard form. So on this problem, the first step is to add 5 to both sides and get the problem into standard form. Now we have x squared minus 6x plus 5 equals 0, and our equation is in standard form. Our next step is to identify our a and b and c values. Now that we know our a, b, and c values, we're ready to put those numbers in for the variables in the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Once you have that memorized, and once you know your a, b, and c value, then you want to replace each variable in the quadratic formula with an empty set of parentheses. Now we're going to take our a value and we're going to put it in for the a's in the quadratic formula. And there are 2 of them. So we'll have a 1 because our a is 1 following the 4. And we'll have a 1 because our a is 1 in the denominator. Our b value is -6. So we'll have a -6 in front of the radical sign. And we'll have a -6 squared inside the radical sign. And finally, our c value is 5. There's only one c value. It's the last number inside the radical sign. So we're going to put our 5 right there. Just like any other quadratic equation, we want to know how many solutions there's going to be before we start looking for the solutions. One part of the quadratic formula has a special name. The b squared minus 4ac is called the discriminant. And as you can see from the picture, the discriminant is a radicand. It's underneath the square root. So it can tell you how many solutions the quadratic equation will have. If b squared minus 4ac is positive, then your radicand will be positive and you'll have 2 real number solutions. If b squared minus 4ac is 0, then your radicand will be 0 and you'll have 1 real number solution. And finally, if b squared minus 4ac is negative, then your radicand will be negative and you will have no real number solutions. So our discriminant has a value of 16, and since it's a radicand and it's positive, we know that our problem will have 2 real number solutions. So I'm going to prepare myself for those 2 real number solutions by writing x equals and x equals at the bottom of the problem. The reason it's a good idea to do the discriminant at the very beginning of the problem is if it turns out that you're doing a problem where the radicand is negative, you'll have no real number solutions and you might be able to stop doing the problem before you ever start. Okay, now we're all set up, we're ready to go. The first step of solving a problem using the quadratic equation is to go in the correct order of operations. You have to be smart to do a quadratic equation problem. And so we're going to square, multiply, add, root, and then do it twice. So our first step is to square And so we're going to take our quadratic equation that we're looking at right here, where we have all of our numbers substituted in, and we're going to recopy the whole problem. The only math that we're going to do is we're going to square the -6 squared underneath the radical sign. The one other thing that we're going to do is in the front right here, there's a negative sign that is part of the quadratic formula, and our b value, the 6, is negative. Those two negatives are going to make the 6 positive. And if we try to write those two negative signs down over and over as we recopy the problem, we might forget one, get it wrong. So we're going to also fix that right now. So this is what our problem is going to look like after the square step. So we squared the -6, and so we have x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 4 times 1 times 5, all over 2 times 1. The next step after square is to multiply. So we are going to multiply. So after we multiply the -4 times the +1 times the +5, and multiply the 2 times the 1 in the denominator, our equation will look like this. So now we have x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 20 over 2. So that's the square step, the multiply step, and the next step, smart, is it's add. And some students think, well, there's no adding in this problem. It's 36 minus 20. It's subtracting. But it's just adding a negative number. So after we add, our problem will look like this. So we have x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 16 over 2. We know that we're doing the problem right because here our radicand is 16. And when we did the discriminant, we found out that the discriminant was also 16. So since they're both the same math problem, it's a good thing that they both came out to the same answer. Okay, smart. We're on the R step. The R step is to take the square root. So we're going to take the square root of 16, and then our problem will look like this. So we have x equals 6 plus or minus 4 all over 2. So we're smart. The last step is to do it twice. And we've already practiced this before. We know that the reason that we have to do it twice is we have to calculate what one answer is by using the +4, and we have to calculate what our other answer is by using the -4. At this point, students make silly mistakes by typing the problem into their calculator incorrectly. So I would suggest that you just don't use a calculator. It's a pretty easy math problem to do in your head. Or if you do use a calculator, make sure you use the fraction button because you can actually get the problem wrong even though we're at the very end. So in the first equation, we have 6 plus 4 over 2. 6 plus 4 is 10 over 2. 10 divided by 2 is going to be 5. So our first answer to this quadratic equation is 5. And the second answer, we have 6 minus 4, which is 2 over 2. And 2 divided by 2 is 1. So the second answer to our quadratic equation is 1. Solve -3x squared plus 2x plus 7 equals 0. Our equation's already in standard form, so we just need to identify a, b, and c. When you're using the quadratic formula, you don't have to worry about what the values of a, b, and c are. Sometimes we want a to be 1 or we want b to be negative. A, b, and c can be fractions, decimals, whole numbers, negative, positive. The quadratic formula will always work. At this point, we're going to use the discriminant to determine how many solutions there are to this quadratic equation. Because our discriminant is the radicand in the quadratic formula, and in this problem our discriminant is positive, we will have 2 real number solutions. Now we're ready to start the quadratic formula.
X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The first step in the quadratic formula is to square. The next step is to multiply.
There seems to be some confusion about whether the 4 is negative or whether the 4 has a minus sign in front of it. That does not matter. Either way, the 4 is negative. So sometimes the A is positive and the C is positive. And so as you can see on the top row of the table, negative 4ac is negative 4 times a positive number times a positive number. That will give you a negative product because you have an odd number of negatives. On the second row of the table, you have negative 4 and then a positive number and then a negative number. In this case, you'll get a positive product because there's an even number of negative signs. In the third row of the table, you have negative 4, and then your A would be negative and your C would be positive. That's going to give you a positive product because you have an even number of negative signs. And on the bottom row of the chart, we have negative 4, we have an A that's negative, a C that's negative. So your product will be negative because there are 3 odd numbers being multiplied together.
After the square and multiply step, the next step is to add. Our radicand is 88, and the answer that we got when we used the discriminant was also 88. That's a good sign that you're doing the problem correctly. The next step is to take the square root. Since 88 is not a perfect square, I'm going to leave the square root exactly the way it is until I get to the end of the problem. And the last step is to do the problem twice so that we get our 2 solutions. Once using the positive square root of 88 and once using the negative square root of 88. The best thing to do at this point in the problem is to just use a calculator and use the fraction button and put the problem in exactly the way it looks. Our first answer is x equals negative 1.23 followed by a 0. The 0 will not round the 3 up to a 4, so our first answer is negative 1.23. And our second answer has x equals 1.89 followed by a 6. The 6 will round the 9 up to a 10, and the 10 will round the 8 up to a 9, so our answer will be 1.90. Those are the 2 solutions to this quadratic equation.
All right, I hope this video helped you to understand how to use the quadratic formula to solve any quadratic equation.